Do you know your rights? The right to bear arms, the right to free speech. It's part of those things we call the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments. The church in Corinth was a lot like us, aware of their freedoms and their rights. I have the right would be a phrase that they would have used. In Romans chapter 8, Paul begins a discussion on the liberty of the believers in Corinth. He must have been asked the question, do we have the right to eat meat offered to idols? Paul answered them, yes, but added an asterisk, a but beware. He wanted them to know that their rights might be a problem for other believers. So it brought up a question that wasn't being asked. What rights am I willing to give up? Evidently, there were those in the church who were willing to protect their rights, even if it meant that they caused other believers to stumble. I know it doesn't sound like a big deal to us, so let me ask it this way. What right would you be willing to give up? What about the right to say something that is hurtful or offensive to your neighbor, or a careless post or tweet that affects how people might view Jesus? Paul told them that he had given up his right to eat meat offered to idols, and he was willing to give up any and all of his rights to win people to Christ. Well, his answer caused people to become defensive, and some in the church began to question his credentials, his authority to speak. So Paul begins in verse 1 and 2 with questions that defended his credibility. Am I not an apostle? Haven't I seen Jesus our Lord with my own eyes? Isn't it because of my work that you belong to the Lord? Even if others think I'm not an apostle, I certainly am to you. You yourselves are proof that I am the Lord's apostle. Then Paul begins to list some of the rights he had given up for them. Since these had to do primarily with finances, it makes me believe that even though this church was very wealthy, they were not very generous. He mentions the right to eat or drink, or have food provided to them by the church. Next, the right to be married, to have a wife that traveled with him instead of working while he traveled. We're given real insight into the personal lives of the other apostles. It seems that all of them, with the exception of Paul, had wives. James, the half-brother of Jesus, Peter, Andrew, Matthew, all of them that had wives that were involved with them in the ministry. Next, Paul talks about being paid a salary from the church instead of working a secular job. Paul was a tent maker who worked a secular job while he started this church in Corinth. There are some who don't believe that the ministry is a full-time job. Paul could be talking to people today who think the pastor should have a secular job while he pastors the church. Listen to the example he gives in the next verses. First, what soldier has to pay his own expenses? In the U.S., we have a volunteer military, but that doesn't mean no pay. Men and women make a career of serving in the military. The next question Paul asks, what farmer plants a vineyard and doesn't have the right to eat some of its fruit? Then he says, since we have planted spiritual seed among you, aren't we entitled to have a harvest of physical food and drink? In verse 14, he said, in the same way the Lord ordered those who preach, the good news should be supported by those who benefit from it. God expects a church, if they are spiritually fed by a pastor, to give of their resources to support him and the other ministries that bless their family. Paul gave up those rights. Paul wasn't in it for the money. He went to places that didn't have a church, where there were no believers. He found a secular job, making tents, and started telling people about Jesus. Paul was willing to give up all of his rights, even to become a slave, to win people to Christ. Slavery was something this people understood. Some of them were slaves. Paul's point was, I have become all things to all men to be able to relate to them. He identified with the customs of the Gentiles. He ate their foods, which would not have been kosher. He learned their customs, learned about their gods. He went to where they were. He said to the weak, I became weak that I might win the weak. I have become all things to all men so that I may by some means save some. That's the challenge for us, to meet people where they are, even if it means that we give up our rights, our comforts, so that we can introduce them to Jesus by what we say, and more importantly, how we live our lives. Will we give up our rights? I hope so.